A very special guest today on The Village Voice, and that special guest is Damien Bohler. Welcome, Damien.
Hi, Peter.
Damien, give people a little background, if you would, of the work that you do and what you bring into the world, because there are those who know and love your work. There are those who know and don't, and there are those who don't. And that's still a large
hmm
portion. So, uh,
Yeah,
how do you take your time, and what is your interest?
yeah. So the work that I do is comes under the umbrella called evolve relating, and really the main focus of this is using relating and relationship as an evolutionary pressure. How do we use the ways that we interact with each other to help us grow, and also to recognize that while there is a strong focus on personal development in the world and there's like a very much individual orientation towards growth and how we do that, there's also a particular domain of relating, of relationship that requires its own development. It's not the same. Developing our own individual self and developing our relational capacity and developing relationships themselves, the way the relationship grows is different. They're not the same thing. It's the same way that growing an economic system is different from growing a meditation practice. There is a vast difference between the two. Right now, my work is largely focused on romantic and intimate relating. It used to be on a broader sense of communication, authentic relating, and I've since narrowed in on romantic and intimate partnering for a couple of reasons. First is just a personal interest of mine and something that I struggled with for a long time and really invested a lot of time, energy, thought, and practice into developing to have a now thriving relationship, something that I didn't have for a long time. Um, and secondly, is that I think it's a very powerful leverage point in that romantic relationship burns so much energy globally. Most movies have some kind of romantic tragedy. Most popular songs are describing some kind of romantic tragedy. There is so much pain and suffering. Single people are suffering for wanting to be in a relationship. People in relationships are suffering from conflict they can't resolve. Marriages are breaking down at bigger, faster rates than ever before. And the amount of energy that is absorbed, wasted by the attempt to try and have this thing that we know inside of ourselves of love, meeting another partner and having a companion on the journey of life, um, that I believe many, many people, I won't say all, really want, is difficult. And that's because we've become a more complex being than we were in the past. So I'm really focusing on those challenges and how do we resolve those challenges so that we can have those kind of relationships. And that energy that's normally sunk into figuring out the problems or lamenting them actually becomes generative. And then we can put it towards more meaningful action in the world and evolving into the more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible, to steal Charles Eisenstein's kind of quote there.
Yeah, indeed. So essentially, what I imagine you're speaking about is a kind of codependent approach, and to morph that into something that is where one is supporting the other rather than kind of taking energy from the other, which is what codependency is about.
Yeah, yeah, like a mutually empowering relationship. Often interdependence is used, and I
Yeah,
almost think even further than that into co-creative relationships where we actually generate energy. The nature of the relationship isn't just generated for myself or my partner, it's generated as a mutual desire, and then we have relationships where we're collaborative in creating the world that we want to live in. So my partner and I are collaborative both in creating our world that we want to live in, but also the bigger world that we want to live into. And how do we use the energy in our relationship for that purpose? And if we're in conflict and codependency and struggle all the time, it's like we don't have any energy to put
yeah,
towards those things. Yeah,
yeah. So that could certainly be a quite a solid journey in itself. In that,
absolutely.
it's not something where you all of a sudden say, "Let's have a conscious relationship here," and it happens. It no doubt
hmm
takes time, energy, effort, and so on in order to bring it to a place of, I guess, of peace,
Yeah.
and then to maintain that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what I'm been investing my time and energy is developing a framework that looks at, and I think of relationship in this way. A relationship is a skill, or it's really a meta skill, meaning that relationship is a collection of skills. And it's not just one skill. There are many skills, and romantic relationship requires a lot of different skills. And so I've really been working on developing a framework of what those skills are and how do we grow them? How do we develop these skills so that we can, just like if we were to be in a community, or let's like homesteading, right? Farming is not just one skill. I've got to learn how to fix fences and repair fences. I've got to learn how to grow crops and seasonal
Right.
timing. I've got to do, it's like lots of different skills. It's not just one. Relationship's the same. To tend to a relationship is many different things that we have to work on.
So, if we take that into that broader context, and the context that I'm working with to a large degree is bringing community together, so small groups of people up to about, well, my numbers are 169, um, people together as a mass, and then watching that turns into relationships that
Yes.
become even more complex because
Yeah.
there are more people involved. And if you then look at the situation we find ourselves in, that uh, once upon a time, maybe several generations ago, it was largely that if you were coupled with a person, you stayed coupled with that person. And that over several decades changed dramatically. Uh, it becomes a deeper discussion. Of course, the core of that is two people. But
Yeah.
are you doing any work that looks at that engagement with groups of people, with love relationships maybe not going where they meant to go, and then being able to stay in the space with those with whom one has argued or disagreed or whatever? Does
Mhm.
your work extend to that?
So I would say in terms of my interest extends into that. The actual work that I'm focused on at this particular moment doesn't, but that's where I'm wanting to head. Community is the thing that's interesting to me. I just realized that I personally needed to spend a lot more time in intimate relationship, and I posit that a lot of people do. And like what you're describing is like when we come into a community and we're coming into a close proximity community, we now have nested sets of skills, right? So
Yes.
we have our intimate relationship, which is a high intensity crucible, but then we extend that out. So not only do we have to learn how to navigate that relationship and all the skills that are inside of that, now that relationship is communicating with other relationships. I'm communicating with other people. My partner is communicating with other people. We have multiple focuses. And so, as you point out, it becomes incredibly complex very, very quickly. And I do believe there are foundational skill sets that rest underneath all of it. So there are some skills that sit inside of intimate relationship that we can apply to all relationship across the board. And then there are some that are specific to relationship. Um, so while I've thought a lot about it, I don't have any other than my work on authentic relating, which is a communication framework. I haven't really lent myself very deeply to the community problem yet, but it's something that is there. It's like not, it's a few years off. Like I can feel it hanging there, and that's where I want to
Good,
go, but it's a few years off. Yeah.
good. And it won't go away because it seems
No,
to me
it's
at
not
least,
going away. It's gonna get
yeah,
louder.
it
Yeah, yeah,
seems so. Yeah. When you
yeah,
look at individual relating, and you look at, for example, the situation that my parents were in, and that's now getting back a bit, it was a very rare thing that a divorce occurred.
yeah,
And yet, a good number of not referencing my parents particularly, but referencing a good number of people from that era, they didn't really demonstrate that they had a happy and satisfying engagement with one another, but rather that they honored their vow and then became proud of how long they had honored their vow because it was a vow.
yeah.
That then shifted. What do you think is the most challenging thing that we navigate in day to day relating these days? Has it changed, and what is that
Oh
precisely?
yeah, 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 yeah. So I'd love to like go in several different directions at once. So I
Good.
might speak. Feel free to interrupt, and I'll track them and come back to them.
Fine.
Um, yeah. So one thing is that we are on a developmental evolving process as humanity. We've been ever since we stood up onto our back legs and started using our hands. We've been in an evolutionary process, and that evolution has happened both physically but also in the individual consciousness and culturally as well. And so we're becoming more complex with each kind of developmental step, there's a increasing complexification of the values that we have. So like you pointed to, your parents and my parents, maybe a little bit beyond them generation, they they had a different set of values, and it wasn't about whether I had a good life or I was happy or not. It was more that like I had a value set that was speaking to a long-term commitment to something higher than myself. And that was the orienting value. That's not the main orienting value anymore. It's become more
Clearly, no.
complex. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so somehow we might need some of that, but actually we now want a partner to make us happy and have us sexually gratified and meet our emotional needs and validate us and be a companion and also be spiritual and growth oriented with us. And so we actually want all of these things, a partner to be all of these things. And there's a certain taxation
Yeah.
involved with that, in that it
And
becomes increasingly
complexity.
challenging. There's a
Yeah.
much more complex. Yeah, which is again, we've expanded the skills needed to navigate that. And I believe that the complexity of relationship has grown faster than the development of the skills needed to maintain it. So that's what I'm interested in. It's like, how do we up our skill game to handle an increased complexity? Because most people, you get hit with that complexity and you blow out. And then there's a second feature on top of that, which makes it even harder, which is the illusion of infinite choice. So we live in a culture where we're connected via a simple thing like Facebook to thousands of people we don't know. And
Yep.
it's very easy to believe that, like, oh, if this person doesn't work out, there's going to be someone better. And I'm always in this, like, there can be someone better, not recognizing that while there are great matches and not as great matches relationally, there isn't a perfect match. There isn't someone who's
Right.
going to like meet you without any need to do any work or skill development or meet them in any way, and boom, you live happily ever after. That's a complete illusion, right? But because we have, a swiping culture, we have online dating and stuff, we believe that like, if I get a little bit of challenge here, I'll just drop it and look for something else because I can't be
Yep.
bothered trying to grow to meet those challenges. And as a result, we have this kind of like, I can't think of the word, but it's like a
Revolving door.
turnstile. Yeah,
Yeah.
revolving door. That's the one. Yeah, a revolving door kind of thing. But it's an illusion. It's not real. Like there's not going to be that perfect person out there that we don't have to do any development in order to be with. We're going to have to grow our capacity and our skill to be with someone no matter what. And that delusion is like I can just keep swiping until I meet somebody that I don't have to do any work with, but it won't happen. And
And
so
that's
I think those two things are making it very challenging.
that's largely also how society largely works in a whole range of arenas.
Yes,
If you look at jobs, they were once gold watch after 50 years. They
that's
were,
right.
you take something on, you could stay with it until the day you walked away and drove a caravan around Australia. Um,
Yeah,
but today, everything is done in kind of tiny chunks, tiny bites.
yeah.
Do you think that we have the capacity to genuinely meet that complexity, or would it be wiser for us to, kind of to do something about narrowing the complexity?
I think we do, and I think that's what the next evolutionary step is demanding of us. It's demanding us to expand our time horizon and start integrating. So in terms of spiral dynamics, which is one developmental model, um, what it looks at is the evolution of values, and the next edge that we're leaning into culturally, and it's not here yet. It's still a very small percentage, which means there's no cultural pockets of it. There's only individuals.
Yep.
Um, Requires that we start an integrative process, which means that we start pulling back the gifts of prior developmental stages and integrating them into a greater whole. Up until now, there's kind of almost like a replacing. We replace the value set that goes, right, I'm going to work for 50 years for the same company and get a gold watch and which is the same value set of I'm going to stay in the same marriage until death do us part. It's the
Correct.
same value set, right?
Yep.
We've replaced that with different value sets. But as we move into an integral consciousness, we start bringing that kind of time horizon back. We recognize that actually we have much more variable choice. It's not I'm just going to have to grind my way through it, but it's a choice. But there is a choice to embrace that bigger time horizon. And we see that the people who are going to emerge out of the the intense complexity that is here will be able to start increasing those time horizons and start to go recognize that, okay, what is a relationship for, right? And that's a very interesting inquiry that I feel myself sitting very, very in the aliveness of right now. I had a session inside of my membership this morning, and that was a question that bubbled up. And I was like, let's not try and find an answer. Let's be
All
in
right.
the inquiry of what actually is a romantic relationship, and what is it for and what does it provide us? And, I can feel in my heart, it's like the shared journey with someone is actually the thing that the ache is for, at least for me.
Right. And
Yeah,
then the investigation is surely how do I maintain my sovereign self? How
that's
do
right.
I hold a space for the other to be their sovereign self? And then the third party is the relationship. It's like
Exactly.
how do we empower this relationship as well as those two sovereign beings?
And that directly expands out to when we're looking at community, right? Because what we're grappling with is a paradoxical equation, and development is always an internal process of resolving paradox. Always. That's how we
Yep.
grow.
Yep.
And so there is this paradox of the individual and the collective. And at a microcosm, it's an intimate relationship. There's me, my individual, and then there's my relationship with my partner. And I'm constantly toggling between where is my position. If I go too far into partnering, I lose a sense of personal identity. And we have what we call codependence. If I go too far into my sovereignty, I lose the tethering to the relationship and we start drifting apart. So we're in this constant dynamic tension between the two of these things. Now we expand that out to a community. It's the same thing. If we're looking at
Yes.
creating the kinds of community that are interdependent and collective, not just we live in the same locale, right? And I think of this as the challenge is to create collectives of highly individuated beings, because we had collectives in the past, but the individuation wasn't strong. We
Yeah.
emphasized the collective rather than the individual. Culturally, right now, we're emphasizing the individual over the collective. And the next step is like, how do we have both at the same time?
Right. Which is essentially back to that same point of
Yes.
introducing some of those old values because they had their place and they held a
Yes.
space, along with the new values that also hold a space, and together perhaps we'll climb mountains.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's a twofold thing. It's a developmental process and it's a skill process. And they're kind of intertwined, right? We kind of like have to develop the skills to create the development, but we also have to develop in order to want to value the skills. So we're having to do this thing. There's like often a seed of awakening where someone goes, I want to live in community or I want a conscious relationship. And then it's like, well, how? How do I do that? And then we have to figure it out. And that's when we start developing, the skill sets that go with that.
In navigating that, even just between two people, is the primary thing finding ways to open communication and keep it open.
So I've been breaking these down into I kind of chunk things down. Let's look at relationship as the top level meta skill, and then we break it down into sub skills and then sub skills inside of that. And it's kind of the way my brain likes to
Your brain
organize
works.
information. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's my gift because I can start presenting information in that way, in which it's digestible. It's my Virgo rising, I call it. So at the top level, we have relationship as a skill, and then I think of it because I think of in terms of evolving relationships, not just standard relationships. I'm thinking of the new paradigm of relationships. So there's an element in there that don't exist in old paradigm of relationships. So that there are kind of like several different categories. First, I think of as self, which is our self skills, which is our ability to regulate our nervous system and our boundary system, essentially, which is our boundary system maintains me as a differentiated being from you. If I have weak boundaries, I start to blur my sense of self with you. And
Yep.
my nervous system keeps me, you know, cognitively awake and aware because my prefrontal cortex is active versus shutting down in a triggered state. So I have to do those things inside of myself.
Yep.
Then we move into recognizing, looking up and seeing there's another. And we start having to go, well, how do I communicate across the gap between you and I. And we have language patterns, but how do we get even more effective at communicating across this gap between you and I? So there's an authentic relating piece, the skill of communication, conflict resolution sits in there, vulnerability, the ability to validate each other, deep listening, all of those things. Then when we're looking at romantic relationship specifically, we now have to look at an attachment piece because we have a nervous system that's wired to bond with others. And
Yes.
primarily, we bond with a romantic partner biologically for the sake of raising children. Whether we choose to raise children or not is irrelevant. That nervous system is still wanting to bond, which is why you spend 3 to 6 months romantically involved and having sex with someone. It's going to hurt when you break up because your attachment has to restructure itself. And that's
Right.
what
Yes.
it does. We connect through the heart to another person, quite literally. Our neurons repattern themselves to bring the imprint of that person into us. So we have to understand how to do that in an effective or functional way versus a dysfunctional way. And we have attachment theory pointing out the dysfunction of attachment, in anxious and avoidant, insecure attachment. So we have to heal that and create a functional bonding pattern with somebody, which is based on security and trust and that deep sense of someone's got my back. When you have that in a relationship, there's like a deep relaxation that occurs and the energy gets liberated.
Yeah.
And we start liberating. When it's not there, we're constantly on edge. There's an anxiety that's running all the time. So we have to liberate that energy. Then again, specific to romantic partnering, we have polarity, masculine, feminine polarity, which is how we create a particular type of energy. Lots of energies create polarity. It's one of the universal fundamental things, up and down, hot and cold, plus and minus,
Of course. Yep.
We have masculine, feminine polarity, which tends to, the most common energy that creates is romantic and sexual energy. We create erotic energy through masculine. If we have no masculine, feminine polarity, there'll be no sexual charge. And while it can be very friendly and nice, there'll be that itch of something missing because we are sexual beings as well. And we're going to want to experience that. So we can cultivate that intentionally so that we can have both, because most of the time, what generates the sexual energy is actually the insecure attachment. The anxious avoidant dance generates sexual polarity because we're constantly on edge. And I'm like, if I don't know if I've got you or not, I'm kind of like turned on in a really fucked up, wounded way by that process. And, and that's what's promoted in movies and songs. Every time I talk about it, I hear that song by Rihanna and Eminem, just gonna, when burn the house down kind of thing. It's like, that's the narrative around, like, because polarity is created through instability. Well, it's like, if we create security as a base, we then have to consciously cultivate our polarity. And we do that through understanding masculine, feminine dynamics and working on them inside of ourselves in relation to each other. And then the last piece, or, one sub skill down, I think of as is awakening skills, because if we're in an evolving relationship, we want to grow together. So how do we actually mutually empower each other into growth? And I like things like the gene keys and human design, and you can do tantra and different types of awakening processes that actually cause us to develop into more sophisticated, elegant beings or spiritual beings. And so that's kind of my model of intimate relating right there.
If you look at the mainstream picture, is very much dedicated, it seems, to the poorly fashioned attachment model, the romantic model that is a kind of happily ever after. It seems to me that there's a lot to be answered for in that, or there is a due process in that which is disempowering by design.
Yeah.
So
I think.
Yeah. Please. So if when you say yes, are you agreeing with disempowering by design?
I don't know. I tend to leave a lot of openness in myself when I start thinking about outside forces designing our experience. I tend to err on the side, I'm not going to deny and I'm not going to accept. I just don't know enough. And I've looked into that. I definitely spent some time researching those kind of things, and it may well be there. It may well be corruption gone rampant. It may well just be, like a dysfunction in our evolutionary process. I don't fully know. So I can't comment on that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, fair call. And in the circumstance that we find ourselves, as you say, popular music is is essentially,
Yes.
if you leave me now, you'll take away the biggest part of me, and I'm burning the house down, and all of those things. And I guess they have a dramatic appeal, and maybe that's something about what we're somewhat addicted to, that dopamine rush of dramatic
Yeah.
circumstance in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, romanticized longing, like the quick hits, the high intensity, the high octane experience, when you meet someone you like, it's like most of us, and we're encouraged to go full speed ahead. It's like you meet someone you love and then suddenly you're like all in. Like on Facebook, I'm part of an anxiously attached group, and I just read it out of fascination, and sometimes I respond, and it's like there is just like it's such an intense all-in kind of way. Like I like someone and that's it. I'm going to ride that high as high as I can possibly go, and kind of neglect the idea that if I do that, I'm going to have a crash. Like it's going
Yeah,
to come, right? And so yes, there tends to be, and we do that, and we have a culture that kind of continually pushes back the consequences of our actions to tomorrow.
yeah,
I can just push it back to tomorrow. I can eat, that whole block of chocolate tonight, and I don't have to think about it. That's a future Damien problem. And it's like it's the wrong approach to think. It's actually like I should be really caring about future Damien because that's me tomorrow.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you wonder sometimes whether, or is it somewhat of an experience of wading through thigh deep, fast drying concrete to bring what you're bringing? Because there is a lot of impetus to take us down a path, which
Yeah.
I guess I perceive as being quite a disempowered path for a myriad of reasons. From diamond sellers wanting to sell diamonds that are essentially valueless except for the value they've made, dressmakers wanting to sell dresses, and on and on and on it goes.
Yeah.
We seem to have been sold down this path, and yet you're one of the voices, with your hand raised above the milling crowd, going, "Excuse me, there's another way."
Yeah. Yeah.
But you don't have Hollywood behind you.
No, and the reality is that like, people sometimes reach out to me and they go, "Wow, you're doing so well on social media." And I'm like, the reality is my audience is tiny. Like really, compared to any of these Hollywood, compared to someone like Taylor Swift or, it's like it's nothing. I don't have much. I have a very small platform. But I'm also like that doesn't matter. Like I'm just going, I care about this and I'm going to do it, and trust that there's a ripple out there, and go for it anyway. Um, and the interesting thing that like you applied the resistance being along the lines of what we would see as kind of the shadow of capitalism, right? And I wouldn't say that's my detractor. I would say I'm too far removed from that. The people who are listening to me and not mired in that. They're not so swayed by that. The thing that I think I get the most attraction from, and this is the one that gives me grief and pulls at me because it's hard again to lift out of that, is the subtle victimhood, right? The post-capitalistic, we call it postmodern movement, in its rejection of capitalism has unconsciously and unwittingly taken on a strong victimhood stance. And there is almost, and we see this in a certain cultural frame of like a celebration of the marginalized. And what that means is then if I can claim marginalization status, then
I,
I can
I
elevate
empower myself.
myself. I
I
empower
empower
myself.
myself.
So what we have is we have a negative rush. We have a rush to the bottom that seems like it's an empowered rush, but it's actually creating this subtle victimhood whereby I need to dwell on and hold on to my pain and make it louder in order to have a voice. And that's the real challenging thing. That's the thing that I find pulls out the most because I'm like, actually, yes, your pain is so, so valid. And the liberation from that, not allowing that to give you a voice, actually the liberation from that and standing above that is what's going to give you the thing that you want. Um, so I think that's where I find the most resistance and the most difficulty with.
The difficulty, I guess, as well, is that now that we all do have somewhat of a voice, We can
Yeah,
gain audience with an empowered story or with a victimized story.
that's
Both
right.
of them, both of them can gain equal traction, and in
Yeah,
some cases, as you're indicating, the victim story might have more drama, so it has a greater attraction, and it's kind of a
yeah,
downward spiral rather than an upward spiral into all we can be. Yeah.
yes.
The conversation moves me towards Rupert Faust's recent post, where he outlined essentially that in a community after the, I think it was shit hits the fan, SHTF, yeah, SHTF scenario, and he painted a scenario that was quite a traditional old school scenario that said, the women will be looking after the children and the men will be making decisions and fighting off whoever they need to fight off and doing the hard yakka. um, uh, and I think one of the things that completely kind of misaligned what he said, took it down into a strange place, was, and the little woman can whisper in the man's ear uh, to make him think it's his idea.
Yeah.
Um, some of those things, I guess, Rupert defended them as being traditional values that had lasted for a very long time. And it's easy to see his point that they were actually traditional values and they did last a very long time. Do you think that they have, even in an environment where all of a sudden we find ourselves with clubs and spears in our hands again, are they a valid pathway for a community after shit hits the fan?
So this is where like I differ in my kind of viewpoint. So yes, they're traditional values, and we spoke about them earlier. That value set sits in the same value set of like till death do us part, and also work for 50 years and get the gold watch. It's the same. It's the same developmental stage where those value sets arise from. Men are this way and women are this way, and that's how it is. And
Yeah,
there's no argument about it. I think the reason why there was so much reaction to that is that it it's not it's not an inclusive perspective. And by inclusive, I don't necessarily mean inclusive in the way that it's used more often. I would say inclusive in the way that it's not integrating, right? Because we can recognize that in the world right now, that kind of differentiation, at least in the Western world, doesn't hold true anymore. Women can be CEOs or mothers. They have a choice. Men
yep,
can be house husbands or farmers. They have a choice. There is actually a choice. And I guess the hypothesis is the scenario is if shit hits the fan, we're going to need to revert and regress to traditional value structures in order to survive. And maybe, maybe my personal sense is that at least what I would like to believe in the narrative that I'm going to hold on to, just because it's
right.
wishful thinking or whatever, is
Yep,
that that kind of pressure will actually force us into integral perspectives, which means that we will recognize that actually there is a position for everyone dependent on on what they want, right? Which means that a woman might be out hunting with the men. So what? A man might be helping look after the children. You know,
yeah,
that there isn't such a clear gender delineation of roles. And I think that that's the thing that really has us recognize when we're moving. And this is like I'm taking my time here because I'm really trying to like get the distinction right. Because
yep,
when we move into an integral community, an integrated stage of development, and I don't believe we have representative communities of that yet. I don't believe we're quite there yet. We're close. We're close in terms of the developmental capacity of humans to hold that, but we're not fully there yet. There is no like the differentiation based on ideas like gender roles dissolves, and we move much more into that collective of highly individuated beings, which recognizes that we operate and function. Shit hits the fan, we've come together as a group, right? Like the zombie apocalypse or whatever shit that we want to
Right.
think about, right?
Yeah.
And we've gone, right, this 169 people have like had to bond together and we've formed a community and gone like our chance of survival is going to be better suited by us all working together than separating into small bands or being on our own. That's the premise, right? So there is the collective organism of which we are all serving,
Yep.
right? And so nature, my body is a collective organism, actually, right? It really is. It's like
Massively
trillions
so.
of microorganisms operating in synergy with each other to make me. So we're
Yep.
doing a version of that. It's something that already exists throughout nature consistently, right? We have to recognize that we become a cell within the organism. But what makes it an integrated community versus a traditional one is that the the differentiation of roles is sourced from an individual. It's sourced from the divine calling of the self in some way. So it's like the essence of the
Right.
soul or the essence of the self goes, this is my place in the community. And there's a deep trust that actually the community requires that of everyone. It requires everyone in their gifts, and people find their position, which is their gift position. And that's what creates a synergy of whole. And we get into this vertical transaction where it's like, I'm giving to the whole and the whole is taking care of me versus I'm transacting with you horizontally, which is what we do right now.
Yep.
And if it's shit hit the fans and there's zombie, we're not going to have currency, at least for some time. The currency is going to be wiped out for a little bit. So it's literally like the currency is the care of the tribe, right? I give to
Yes.
the tribe and the tribe cares for me. That's the currency exchange. And again, it's this vertical transaction. When we move to a traditional idea, those are going to be, and this is what makes it a regression versus an integration. Because if we go back in time, those would have been emergent sets of values based on particular strengths and skills and so on and so forth. But that doesn't hold the same weight anymore because technology gives us a force. Even if shit hits the fan, we're still going to have technology because our,
Yep.
our minds are going to create technology out of whatever we can. We're not going to suddenly have no electronics and no mechanical engineering and be just
Seriously, yeah,
straight down.
you make a
We're
two-way
not.
radio out of a few things that you
Yeah.
find. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not like it's all of a sudden going to go away. Yes.
Yeah, people are going to be able to create agricultural implements and hunting implements, and it's all going to be, there will be a crude agrarian techno kind of society.
Yes.
Um, so that technology affords us to differentiate in this way. And so that's the difference that I see is that it may look like that. There may be choices that are made where women will be like, actually, my desire is to be with the children and actually be behind the man who's the leader and kind of influence that way. But it may also be some women who like, no, I want to be up in the leadership committee,
Yeah.
and as we move into school, it's not going to care. We're not going to care who does what, only that the organism thrives. That's the orienting point.
So that then takes me to the follow on from that on this particular topic. In that Rupert, who I know reasonably well,
Yeah.
has now had his set cancelled at a major festival. Has had people publicly remove themselves from the space on the basis that he postulated something. Wasn't even presented as this is a now thing. It was like, if we're in trouble, this is what I think the model would be. Uh, there's some concerning matters for me around the censorship of points of view,
Yeah.
that and a cancel culture that seems to exist, even though we've expanded into this place where we all have some kind of voice. There's also this kind of backward pressure that says, well, make sure your voice is in alignment with mine or I'll shut you down. Um, uh, uh, and again, this is a relating matter. It's about us becoming authentically ourselves and allowing others to be authentically themselves and finding a way through.
Yeah. Yeah. Cancel culture is an interesting shadow, and I call it a shadow. This is not a healthy expression of where we are currently. The ability to create a swell that can literally destroy someone's livelihood based on something they said is not a healthy thing. That is
Right.
not a good thing. That is not something that we want to create, because it does create a limitation or a fear around what can be said. And then so it does determine what is able to be said and what is able to be explored. Now, at the same time, even as a shadow expression, we could look at it as a like a strong anti-inflammatory or immune system response to potential viruses, perhaps gone rampant, right?
Right.
Perhaps it's not, it has a hypersensitivity and it's seeing things as threats that might not be threats, and people who shouldn't be canceled are being canceled, and people who should be canceled or should be called into account are not, right? Some of our politicians and some of they should be the ones that we should be looking at and going, hang on a second, the decisions you're making, yet they seem somehow to have built immunity, whereas people who are not necessarily actually genuinely a threat through the intensity of this immune response can be perceived as a threat, which is
Yes.
like, for example, if if I eat something funny, my body can go into like extreme detox response and go, that's a bacteria, but it's actually not, and it can make me sick as a result. Um, so I think that there's something that we have to be mindful around that, and the hysteria around cancel culture is almost like you're a threat because I say you are, and
Yes.
I've had that leveled on my posts as well. The things that I say are dangerous, and I'm like, it's not dangerous to a society who has the ability to critically think, and you're stepping in to protect other people, nameless, faceless people. It's like
Good.
I can then become the champion and I can cancel you on behalf of the vulnerable, nameless, faceless people that I decided I am the champion of in order to cancel you. Versus,
Who've actually or not advanced their perspective at all. So
that's right.
it's like I'll
Yeah.
defend you whether you want to be defended or not.
Exactly, exactly. And so there's not actually it actually removes the voice. So there's a latent hypocrisy in it. It actually removes the voice and the ability for people to critically think for themselves by suggesting that I am the champion of whether this is, and I get to decide whether it's dangerous or not. And if I can generate enough of a swell, if I can rally a mob, it essentially is, it's a mob of people with
Yep.
pitchforks. I can create this on behalf of the idea that I've decided it's dangerous. That's dangerous, right? That actually is dangerous, because then we and I can feel it in myself, the level of awareness and mindfulness I have to be because of that, especially given the fact that I'm a white male, right? That, like there
Yeah.
is a position that I occupy that gives me a privilege and an anti-privilege at the same time. It gives me
Yes.
both, right? Um, so then I also want to speak just briefly to the potential other side. What I find is that when we have a growth mindset, we also allow pressures to bring us into more grace and elegance. So what the more intense the immune system or the alarm, the more conscious or mindful I have to become, which means that I have to investigate my own thoughts. I have to be aware of latent misogyny that exists inside me, latent patriarchy that exists inside me, unexamined things inside me, ageism and enableism and all of these things. I have to examine those, and I have to strip when I'm presenting myself publicly, I have to go, is that present? And I have to strip it out through consciousness, because there is such a hypersensitivity, which
Yep.
allows me to become cleaner. It allows me to become more graceful and elegant. And it also allows me to grow through shadows that I might not necessarily reflect on without this pressure. I might ride through my life with deeply embedded misogynistic attitudes that have come through my great grandpa and never actually been examined. And I never have to look at them because there's no pressure to, right?
Yeah.
But the fact that there is a sensitivity means that I have to, especially as I become a public figure. So, everything is a double-edged sword, right?
Has a light and dark, so to speak. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
When we look at that, there was also maybe, I guess, 5 to 10 years ago, there was a fairly solid movement across most social media to remove those people who included within their teachings sexuality. So,
Yes.
you can publish something that says I'm a relationship coach or I do relationship work, or that can be published almost anywhere. But as soon as you put three letters in a row, sex or sexuality or sexual or sex something, uh, there is a kind of cancelling of that on most of the internet. Can you
Yeah.
speak to that for a moment? Why? What is going on the basis that
Yeah.
porn uses up more of the internet than anything, and
Yeah.
yet we have this kind of whole cancelling
Yeah.
of sexuality and deep learning in that arena
Yeah.
by major players.
So I'm gonna hypothesize on this. So I don't fully know what's happened there. But my hypothesis is this is an example of why we have to be careful of cancel culture because we don't recognize the consequences. When we swell up as a mob and go, that's wrong, we don't necessarily understand because again, our time horizons have got a bit funky, the downstream consequences of that, right? We've gotten good at starting to understand downstream consequences of industry. So we can look at downstream consequences of pollution and the impacts that that might cause over time. And that's,
Sure.
but we haven't understood downstream consequences of psychology, of
Of the
cultural
information
memes being
age.
propagated. Exactly.
Yeah.
And the way that the rapidity with which cultural memes can propagate themselves. So I would suggest that what has happened with sex is probably an early consequence of a cancel culture type movement, perhaps before that word was even used, which probably comes from a very well-meaning intention, which is likely to protect children and sexually abused individuals,
Yeah.
to to strip out any focus on sexuality in the public or social domains so that we can create a safer environment. But what's happened is that we've obviously created a censorship environment around that, which has no discrimination. It doesn't discriminate. And this is where we have to be careful because cancel culture doesn't discriminate very well. This whole
Right.
bear movement currently,
Yeah.
whilst I see the validity in it, there's a lack of discrimination through the generalization. So we're not understanding the downstream consequences of what we're doing with these generalized kind of ideas. So
So just
bringing
can
up
I,
sex.
let me stop you on that for a minute. Are you sure we don't understand? I mean, I I see something like that, and I comprehend it far more deeply than whether I'd like to be there with a man or a bear.
Yeah,
It's there is comprehension that, hang on, this I can see that someone does this in order to make a point, but there's a dark side to that
that's
that
right.
essentially for example, puts all men into that category. This many women detest or would be feel safer with a bear than a man. That's disempowering from every
Absolutely.
aspect. From every
Exactly.
aspect.
And I love that you bring up sex because so let's tie these two things together so we can kind of get a little bit of a sense of what's happening here. So we now have this propagation of we choose men, right? I mean, sorry, we choose the bear, right? We choose the bear. There's this sentiment floating around, we choose the bear. Like every time I hear or see that, it's like it hits me in such a like confusing way. There's part of me that goes like, I have to understand women's pain around that, but I have to separate myself from the pain of hearing that in order to do that.
Yes.
Bears, a wild animal is more desirable than me. And because it's been generalized, there is no ability to separate myself. I have to do that internally, right?
Yeah.
And I'm a man with a certain level of development, and I've done a lot of work on regulating my nervous system and a lot of work on increasing my complexity to the ability that I can pass out those things. But even then, I kind of have to work pretty hard to separate the two, right? A man who we're trying to illuminate, hey, we want you to be aware of the impacts of women, I would suggest is already in a reactive state. A man that can inflict violence to a woman is not someone who is in a regulated state with his mind open, ability to have empathy and compassion. He doesn't have that capacity. If he did, he wouldn't do that action.
Yeah.
So he will not be able to pass out those two things. What he hears is men suck. Well, women suck.
Yeah.
Fuck women. I'm not going to be interested in their safety. I'm going to be interested in their safety even less. They hurt me even more, so I care about them even less. So we have this, again, race downwards, this bottom spiraling, and we're going to have downstream consequences where we're actually going to increase the pain in men, which will increase violence and male suicide, probably the two horrible things. And the understanding that we're seeing is the understanding of people who already have the capacity to understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so
And have probably
when we
already taken steps to be in that place in any case. So yeah, if you're talking to a non-responsive human in regard to those matters, their response is likely to be a need to defend themselves or a need to
exactly,
to fight that, and
yeah,
that's really not what the original aim. Surely was not what the original aim was.
no, and the original aim is valid and so important. Like it's important that women don't feel safe. Like when I can separate myself from that scenario and the anguish of like just another layer of inherent shame if I'm a man, like I can feel inside of me the thing that gets activated, the defensiveness is like I'm a man and there's something wrong with that. Like I feel like I've had that since childhood, right? Because we were growing up in a society. I was growing up in a culture that is kind of was the start of that movement. So there's another layer of like there's something wrong with me being as a man. Oh, that hurts. When I can separate that, it's like the fact that women feel afraid of men is horrifying, right? That's horrifying, and we need to do something about that, right? And the same thing when we pull it back to sex, the idea that sexual abuse occurs. I was sexually abused as a child, right? By someone who lived in the house behind us, right? Happens to women, happens to men, happens to children, right? That we create a movement around that then the downstream effects is that we're seeing
Yes.
suppression on all fronts. Sacred sexuality and healthy sexuality is suppressed as much as, at least on the social media front, as pornography. And you can also find side streams where that it goes into the shadows, right? It all
Yeah.
goes into the shadows.
Yeah.
So while it's not a one-to-one correlate, the fact of this kind of upswell that isn't aware of the stories we're telling, the generalization of men as perpetrators, is going to have downstream consequences that we're not going to be fully aware of, but they're not being anticipated by as the mob rallies, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, the way forward then seems to be very much the kind of work perhaps that you and I are doing, that
Yeah.
that to create integration, to I could certainly not claim to be particularly good at the whole individual relating business.
Mm.
Single man at 65, and that's just how it's turned out. However, I see the dynamics that exist. I look at the harm that many of those dynamics are doing, and then when I open that to a greater scale across a community of people and see how we have largely forgotten how to interact with one another, whether it be in a romantic relating or whether it be just, I guess, having each other's back, being there for each other. The
Totally.
teaching has been deep for individuation, make it for yourself, and screw everyone else.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like the current thing around the bear is that it's like I start thinking about it in the microcosm of the relationship where, one party has been really hurt by the other party's behavior. And so they've got some lingering anger and rage and resentment around that and unable to articulate that in a way that can be felt. And the other person unable to drop into enough to feel and validate and apologize for that. We end up having a scenario where there's a lot of high activation, a lot of words are said, and we start throwing insults at each other. Insults, defense, attack, a defense, attack, a defense. If that carries on too long in a romantic relationship, there's a point where it becomes irreparable, right? Or it takes a lot of time to repair. It takes like countless therapy sessions and ability to hear each other and restore and repair trust. And why I'm challenged by this current movement is it's like it's adding another layer of that name calling to the thing, and there's some being heard and there's some not being heard, and so I'm
Yeah.
just like, how do we take it down to the point where it's like I'm hurting, Like that's
Yeah.
the vulnerability is I'm hurting and I'm scared. Not like I choose bears over men. It's like I'm really scared. I'm really scared of men, and I want to just be in the vulnerability of that. It's like, oh, when
Yeah.
I hear that from my partner, when my partner expresses vulnerably a fear or an anger or a frustration that doesn't condemn me, I can't help but be broken by it,
Yeah.
and I just want to be closer. Yeah.
Yeah. I had a good number of conversations some time ago where, like 20 years ago, where I had people presenting to me that the principal problem with men was that they are violent. And I shared with them that, if I happened to be in a house with them alone and someone came to the door with an axe, I said, who needs to answer the door? And the several women that I was speaking to said, well, you do. And I said, well, isn't it possible that I'm just as afraid as you? Isn't it possible that I feel just as poorly equipped as you? Isn't it? Why me? And it was because you're a man. And so slightly bigger bulk, perhaps, and probably slightly different musculature. And still, that man came from a little boy who was as defenseless as anyone, who then goes, so what? Now I go to the front door to die? Is that how this works? It was a real meeting point of understanding that, while violence is decried as a terrible thing in the masculine, it's also called for in the masculine, and that's
Yeah.
a dichotomy that's really hard to
And
balance.
and historically, the men did go to die, right? I don't
Yeah,
necessarily agree with the premises of the wars that we had. I think that they were incorrect. But whenever there was a perception of threat, the men would go off to die.
yeah,
Whenever there is a ship going down, men get rescued last. There is an inherent sacrificial nature. And I also believe, to tie this back to Rupert's piece, is that while we can focus on the invalidation of the capacity for the feminine being to to choose her role, in the same piece, the man was at the front. He's the one who has to defend off the zombies, right?
yeah,
And if the piece was genuinely inclusive, and this is where things start to break down a little bit, and we said, I'm a man and I'm like, I don't want to go and fight the zombies. I want to like stay back and look after the kids. What the fuck are you talking about?
right.
Get up there at the front. You don't get that right. Well,
You
if we're
coward.
going to be an integrative society where roles are chosen, which is where we need to be, then that has to be as sacred as anything else, right? It has to be. And I can feel even in myself the inherent like no-ness to that, like disgust at a man who would be like, my role is actually to look after the children and feed the children versus like try and fight off the zombies. I'm like, what kind of loser are you? It's like, well, it's inside of me, you
The
know?
teaching is deep. The teaching is
Yeah.
deep and has been around for a very long time. And yeah, it
Yeah.
does
And
position
that
us
man is
with
absolutely not fuckable, right?
right. That too. That too.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, there's the oppositional the oppositional
Yeah.
partner that basically, I want to go and shoot people. Then I'll come back and get you
which
later.
which is, and I wrote a couple of pieces about that recently, because there is a developmental stage where I call it the boss babe and the sensitive man, right?
Yeah, I
There
comment.
is a stage, yeah, right, where women develop a fierce independence and they go out and get in the world, and there are relationships in the world where the woman plays the provisional role and she makes the money and she hustles and she's the CEO. And the man is at home looking after the kids and he's softer and sensitive and he's the one like running her a hot bath when she comes home and he's taken care of. And that is a polarity, right?
Yeah,
Sure, we can say the woman's playing the masculine pole, but again, our bias is that the masculine pole is inherently male. It's not, it's just masculine, right? And it's
that
really hard to
conversation.
tease those two things apart. It's
Oh
really, really
yeah,
hard to psychologically tease masculine and man apart. And that's why people go, let's get rid of masculine and feminine and use something else. I'm like, even if you use different labels, you're still going to link them,
yeah, yeah. It's
but
an
we
attribute.
can tease them apart. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an attribute, not a consideration of what body a
Yeah.
person's in.
Yeah.
Masculine attribute is just a word for these kinds of things, and feminine
Yeah.
attribute is these kinds of things, but we make it
That's right.
into man and woman. Yeah,
And they polarize with each other. That's the thing. They do.
Yes.
They create a reciprocal pole to each other, which if we want to experience romantic energy and sexual energy and erotic energy, we have to have the poles. Doesn't matter really who plays what pole, just that they have to be there, right? You know,
Yeah.
plus
Indeed.
and plus repels, you know,
Yep.
plus and plus romantically repels. You know, even when you see in gay couples, you'll see a polarization occur,
Of
right?
course. Yes.
It's just what
Yeah.
happens. Yeah.
Damien, a word of advice for our world from Damien Bohler. You know, like if you had 30 seconds on the world stage, this one might get you a few views, but it's hardly going to be a world stage. But let's imagine you have 30 seconds and you've got 150,000 people, and someone says, "Look, here's the microphone. Go and tell them what you would most want to tell them in that 30-second piece, that what you would most want to offer them as a recommendation for going forward as an integrated human in life."
I'm a little bit on the spot right
Yep.
now. So, but what comes to mind immediately is kind of the premise is that in order to evolve, we're going to have to consider the ways that we relate to each other. And we have to recognize that relating is a skill and we need to expend as much intention and effort in developing that skill as we do any other skill, any economic or financial or physical or personal development skill. And we aren't going to evolve into the world that we know is possible without developing our ability to relate to each other more consciously, more effectively.
Damien Bowler, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Pete.